I'm Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Dr. James Johnson to speak with us in the lab community on the subject of artificial intelligence, nuclear strategy, and risk in the digital age. I think this is a great follow-up from our speaker that we had last week, Dr. Timothy Grayson from DARPA, who briefed us on the concept of mosaic warfare. I mean, once again, we're diving into this nexus, right, of something old and familiar to many in nuclear strategy and the more traditional concepts of strategic stability, and something new in the form of emerging and potentially disruptive technologies here, in particular with artificial intelligence. And we've got a great speaker to do this. He's written prolifically on the subject. James is an assistant professor in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University, and a non-resident fellow with the Modern War Institute at West Point, where you can read his articles, and he's done some very recently. He was previously a postdoctoral research fellow at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies in Monterey, California. And he completed his PhD in politics and international relations at the University of Leicester, where he's an honorary visiting fellow. I'll also take the opportunity to highlight he has a recent book out, which I'm sure he's very proud of, titled "Artificial Intelligence in the Future of Warfare: USA, China, and Strategic Stability." So why is this such a valuable discussion for the lab community here? And I think it's a great opportunity to highlight some of the more interesting themes from James's work. I think the first is James is noting that most of the research on military AI applications is focused on the very tactical level. The use of certain systems to achieve certain effects on the battlefield. And I think James is going to take us here up to the more strategic level, right? Some of the larger questions about underlying deterrence theory, about our thinking about strategic stability in terms of arms race stability, crisis stability, the very traditional notions of strategic stability, and get that examination of AI and its applications up to another conceptual level as we think through, both the benefits and the downsides to an emerging technology such as that. I think the second thing that James is very good at is this idea of risks and trade-offs, right? Much of the research that you see on artificial intelligence and military applications is fairly one-sided in its approach to things, especially when they start combining AI-enabled technology with anything having to do with nuclear weapons and nuclear decision-making. It's either a very categorical sort of, no, don't do it at all, it's very highly dangerous, here are all the reasons it's dangerous, or it's yes, absolutely, you have to do it because of the increasing speed of decision-making, actions of our adversaries, et cetera. So I think it's useful here to get a balanced perspective, right? And James is very good about that in terms of, everything you do involves risks and trade-offs to some extent, right? So don't approach it from a wholly good or wholly bad situation. Everything is a balance between the improvements and the downsides. And then finally, I think James's work is useful because it's practical, right? It gets at some interesting recommendations for the future, some interesting food for thought that I think we can take and put in our brains for how we think about designing nuclear structures, postures, and philosophies of use in the digital age. So I'm really looking forward to the presentation, and I'm so happy James can join us here today. Just the standard reminder on protocol here as Katie starts to pull up James's slides. James is going to speak here for about 30 to 45 minutes. His prepared remarks are going to be recorded and will likely be posted subsequently on the CGSR website. When he's concluded his remarks and his slides, we'll open up the floor to sort of questions and answers for the remainder of the time we have available. That content is going to be off the record and not for attribution, so we can have a free and open discussion. As James is presenting, feel free to submit your questions electronically to myself or Katie Thomas at any point during the presentation, or raise your hand electronically. The sooner you do either of those two things, the more likely you are to get your question answered or your hand recognized. And if you raise your hand, be sure to stand ready when I call on you and Katie unmutes you, so we can fit in as many speakers and as many questions as we can in the time we have available. So James, thank you for taking the time to join us today, and over to you for the presentation.
Thank you. I'd like to extend my thanks there to Brad Roberts, as well as Michael, for his generous introduction and inviting me to talk to you today. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to once again engage with CGSR. And a big thanks to Katie for facilitating this event and helping me with the slides today. And apologies in advance for any kind of unashamed self-promotion during this presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll begin with a brief AI primer to ground the discussion in what we mean by AI in a military context. Next, I'll outline some of the core arguments and research themes from my new book and related projects. This section includes several fictional scenarios or thought experiments to consider the possible real-world consequences of my findings. I will close out with a brief discussion on the policy implications of this research, leaving some time for comments and Q&A. Next slide, please. So artificial intelligence research began as early as the 1950s, but an explosion of interest in the field occurred around a decade ago due to the convergence of four key developments: the exponential growth in computer processing power, expanded data sets, especially big data sources, advances in the implementation of machine learning techniques and algorithms, especially deep neural networks, and perhaps most importantly, the rapid expansion of commercial interest and investment in AI. Now, because of the diverse approaches to AI-based research, there is no universally accepted definition of artificial intelligence, which has caused confusion when the term has been applied generically to make grandiose claims about its so-called revolutionary effects. In fact, any task that AI is capable of fulfilling is often judged to be, by definition, revolutionary. AI is generally viewed as a subfield of computer science, focusing on solving computational problems through search, heuristics, logistics, reasoning, and probability. AI draws heavily from mathematics, philosophy, linguistics, psychology, and especially neuroscience. In a military context, AI is better thought of as a potential enabler and force multiplier of an existing range of advanced weapon systems. Thus, in this way, AI is more akin to radio or radar or electricity than a standalone weapon per se. Conceptually speaking, military AI applications can be categorized into those that have a use at an operational, tactical, and strategic level of warfare. Today, while the potential tactical and operational impact of AI is reasonably self-evident, its effect at a strategic level remains, however, uncertain and untheorized in the literature. The goal of my research is to address this gap. Next slide, please. These two Venn diagrams illustrate the connections between several and often misused terms, concepts, and disciplines that relate to AI, and associated more broadly with the so-called fourth industrial revolution. Especially relevant to this talk are machine learning algorithms and autonomy. Next slide, please. This flowchart depicts the evolving so-called AI ecosystem and some of the various portfolio of capabilities that AI technology can enable, such as image, speech, and text recognition, information gathering and dissemination, predictive analysis, and machine vision. Next slide. So my thesis is grounded in four interrelated arguments. First, in isolation, AI has few discernible or direct effects on nuclear stability. That is to say, as a standalone capability, AI will unlikely be a game changer or silver bullet. Rather, much like cyberspace, it will more likely mutually reinforce the destabilizing effects of existing weapon systems. In short, AI does not exist in a vacuum. In this way, AI can be better understood as a manifestation or accelerator of an established trend in emerging technologies associated with things like increasing the speed of warfare, shortening the decision-making time frame, and commingling or blurring of nuclear and non-nuclear weapon systems. Second, AI's impact on stability, deterrence, and escalation will likely be determined as much, if not more so, by states' perceptions of its functionality and what it is tactically or operationally able to do. For example, even if autonomous drone swarms were not intended to be, or even capable of, a disarming first strike, the perception alone of this feasibility of such an operation would elicit distrust between nuclear states and be destabilizing nonetheless. Good case in point was the diplomatic standoff that followed China's seizure of a US undersea drone in 2016. The incident, while thankfully de-escalated, demonstrated clearly some of the potential risks of inadvertent escalation caused by strategic ambiguity about the deployment of new technology in contested territory between adversaries. Third, the simultaneous pursuit of AI by great military powers, thinking here of China, United States, and Russia, will likely amplify the destabilizing effects of AI in the military context. In the second nuclear age, consisting of 9 nuclear powers with varying degrees of interest, capabilities, and perceptions of their place in the world order, AI will likely compound the impact emerging technology is already having on peacetime deterrence and likely have during crisis of conflict between nuclear armed rivals. In this way, nuclear multipolarity is important precisely because different states will choose different options to address the new choices emerging in the digital age. Finally, and related, against this rather inopportune geopolitical backdrop, the perceived benefits of AI-powered weapons will likely prove irresistible to certain states in order to asymmetrically capture or sustain the technological upper hand and first mover advantages vis-a-vis rivals. Echoing these sentiments, the US National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, in its final report, stated that without the adoption of AI, the US would, quote, almost certainly lose the ability to defend the United States and its allies. Next slide, please. This section will unpack 5 research themes that consider how and why AI-fused capabilities might cause or exacerbate escalation risk, complicate deterrence, and impact crisis stability dynamics in future conflicts between nuclear armed rivals. These include the commingling of technology and escalation risk, hyperspeed warfare and compressing decision-making, the AI stability versus instability debate, the risk of catalytic nuclear war, and the dilemma of automating decision-making to machines. Connecting these research threads are 3 features of the digital age that I argue will further complicate nuclear stability, including information overload and complexity, disinformation, and greater automation of nuclear command and control, communication, or NC3 systems. Next slide, please. Okay, so today there are multifaceted possible intersection of AI with a range of state-of-the-art, non-nuclear strategic weapons that may compromise states' nuclear assets in conventional counter-force operations. For example, cyber weapons, precision munitions, and anti-satellite and hypersonic weapons. The increasingly complex interactions within tightly enmeshed systems that now control both nuclear and conventional weapon systems have become a critical risk in the digital age. This commingling problem set is further aggravated by 2 recent developments. First, the blurred boundaries between advanced conventional and nuclear systems, And second, an increasingly political willingness, especially the United States, Russia, and arguably China, to use nuclear weapons to respond to conventional attacks that target an adversary's nuclear assets, such as early warning systems, command and control facilities, and nuclear launch sites. In fact, this was made explicitly clear in the DoD's 2018 Nuclear Posture Review. AI-enabled capabilities could also complicate nuclear deterrence in several ways, making it easier to find nuclear assets, attacking NC3 systems with cyber weapons, and deploying drones, especially micro-drones in swarms, in surveillance recon and preemptive strike operations against nuclear deterrence assets, such as early warning systems, antennas, sensors, and air intakes. The impact of these kind of operations will be more severe in an asymmetric conventional skirmish. For example, an anti-access aerodynamic contest between nuclear-armed states, where using or losing pressures may exist to strike preemptively. In short, the introduction of increasingly capable advanced technology like AI into the nuclear enterprise is already beginning to challenge some of the long-held assumptions about deterrence, escalation, crisis stability, and arms control. Next slide, please. So consider the following scenario. State A attacks State B's early warning systems located in State B's non-nuclear missile launch sites as a purely tactical maneuver. Now, because these systems are also used by B to warn them of an imminent nuclear strike, that is, their dual use in nature, B concludes the attacks are a prelude to a destabilizing first strike. Thus, an action A intended to remain under the nuclear threshold, B views as deliberate escalation. That is, B assumes that A must know that an attack on its dual systems will be highly escalatory. Because B does not consider its behavior as offensive, it views B's responses as highly provocative, thereby triggering inadvertent escalation. China, for example, is believed to commingle its nuclear and conventional early warning, situational awareness, and surveillance systems, which many experts believe increase the kind of inadvertent risk illustrated here. Next slide, please. This chart shows some AI applications that are either being tested, developed, or in some cases already deployed within the nuclear deterrence architecture, including early warning and command and control systems, precision strike and delivery, and non-nuclear deterrence operations such as cyber warfare, missile defense, and counter space forces. Next slide, please. AI introduces a unique means to operate and respond at gigahertz or machine speed in the use of military force. To be sure, in military arenas where a premium is placed on autonomy and speed, faster reaction times, for example, gathering and analyzing intel for cueing long-range precision missiles, will likely have an outsized strategic effect. Now, a key point to emphasize here is that these massive increases in the speed of combat could result in machines reacting to situations at a pace that surpasses human comprehension. So much so that commanders might be unable to control, contain, or in a worst case scenario, terminate events. Imagine, for example, if the Cuban Missile Crisis was truncated from 13 days to a matter of hours or even minutes. I argue, therefore, that until experts unravel some of these unexplainable and unpredictable or so-called black box features of AI, human error and machine error will likely compound one another with uncertain and unexpected outcomes. For now, at least, it remains axiomatic that human decisions escalate or de-escalate a situation. However, technology like AI that enables weapons to operate at higher speeds, ranges, and lethality could potentially move a situation more quickly and possibly inadvertently up the escalation rungs to a nuclear level of conflict. Next slide, please. So is AI a double-edged sword for stability? On the one hand, AI-augmented command and control support tools, such as pattern recognition technology, may overcome some of the inherent shortcomings to human strategic decision-making, things like the tendency to invest in sunk costs, skewed risk judgment, heuristics, and groupthink, with potentially stabilizing effects. Besides, faster and more reliable AI tools could enable commanders to make more informed decisions during a crisis. Additional benefits might include improving the safety and reliability of nuclear support systems, strengthening cyber defenses of command and control networks, improving or enhancing battlefield situational awareness, creating new and innovative solutions for arms control and monitoring nuclear stockpiles, and potentially reducing false positives or so-called close calls, and the risk of human error caused by fatigue, repetition, and cognitive bias. On the other hand, the introduction of multiple data streams could equally overwhelm the ability of human decision makers to determine the credibility of data, particularly if the provenance and validity of the information cannot be easily verified, or especially the information is manipulated. Moreover, information overload and complexity could create new vulnerabilities and potential sources of errors, or a so-called new security paradox, which motivated state or non-state actors could exploit. This problem set is compounded by the shortened response times available to decision makers, and particularly where a launch and warning posture is present. In sum, absent human judgment and control, together with the inherent brittleness of machine learning algorithms, the risk of destabilizing accidents and false alarms is set to rise. Next slide, please. So how might AI tools in the hands of nefarious third-party actors drag nuclear adversaries into conflict? In the digital era, the catalyzing chain of action and reaction dynamics set in motion by a third-party actor, taking two nuclear rivals to the brink, I argue is first becoming a more plausible scenario. To be sure, the historical record is replete with examples of nuclear false alarms, accidents, and other risks associated with increasingly complex, porous, and interconnected NC3 systems, which, despite their alleged closed nature, offers motivated actors with multiple pathways for manipulation and exploitation. In the digital age, decision makers are exposed to greater volumes of information, such as satellite imagery, 3D models, and geospatial data, which during a crisis can create novel attack pathways to manipulate and propagate campaigns of mis and disinformation. In theory, a non-state actor could target nuclear command and control systems, early warning satellites, and radars with AI-enhanced cyber weapons, crucially without the need for kinetic capabilities, let alone the possession of nuclear weapons, to have Tom Schelling's power to hurt. Now, while such an attack would likely be beyond the abilities and resources of opportunistic or less sophisticated non-state actors or terrorists, emerging technology like AI will likely lower this threshold, creating new pathways to accomplish malevolent goals, especially through the manipulation and distortion of the information landscape where decision-making takes place. For example, spreading disinformation conspiracy theories, false memes, and fake news on social media. During a crisis involving two nuclear powers, when communications are compromised or severed, nuclear arsenals are on high alert, decision-making timeframes are compressed, and especially if nuclear launch authority is pre-delegated, the consequences of information operations could be catastrophic. A good case in point is the 2019 Indian-Pakistan crisis, which combined a toxic mixture of cross-border terrorist attacks, disputed territory, offensive nuclear postures, and escalatory rhetoric playing out on social media, including implicit nuclear threats, thus making it reasonably easy to imagine how the actors of a third-party actor might spark an accidental nuclear war. This dynamic is compounded by the human tendency to make fast, reflective, and heuristic or short judgments, or so-called system one thinking, when an abundance of information and complexity exists alongside unfamiliar and new technologies. This can mean that manipulated and false information is accepted as fact, even if it can be easily debunked. To recap, AI-powered technology is rapidly becoming another capability in the toolkit of third-party actors to wage campaigns of disinformation and deception, which both sides in a competitive dyad might have used against them. Next slide, please. AI machine-generated deepfakes have added a new twist to the risk of miscalculation, misperception, and inadvertent escalation that originate in the virtual world, but can have a very real impact in the physical one. For example, to incite conflict between two rival states during a crisis, State A hires proxy hackers to launch a deepfake video depicting a senior military commander of State B conspiring to launch a preemptive nuclear strike on State C. This footage is then deliberately leaked into C's intelligence gathering and analysis systems, putting C under intense domestic political pressure to escalate the situation with an unprovoked retaliatory strike. B, fearful of a decapitating strike and losing the first mover advantages, responds in kind. Now, while social media platforms have had some success in slowing down users' ability to orchestrate disinformation campaigns like this, once operations go viral, for example, deepfakes and bots, the ability to curtail them is extremely difficult, both for human operators and machines. Again, during the 2019 Indian-Pakistan crisis, and despite Facebook's countermeasures, fake news and doctored images reach more than 2.8 million WhatsApp users. Taken together, the increasingly sophisticated and accessible disinformation technology, the dual-use nature of artificial intelligence, the problem of attribution in cyberspace, increasingly complex and interdependent NC3 systems, together with compressed decision-making, will continue to lower the threshold for false flag information operations. For example, fake nuclear alerts or subverting real alerts via social media. Next slide, please. So how might delegating decisions to machines affect stability and deterrence? During crisis conditions, the deterrent effect of AI, very much like other capabilities, is predicated on the perceived risks associated with a particular capability it might enable or enhance. the higher the uncertainty generated by capacity. Thus, deploying AI capabilities into a crisis might encourage an adversary to act more cautiously, thereby increasing its deterrent effect. Put another way, a critical factor is to what degree a particular capability disproportionately affects states' perceptions of the balance of power. So counterintuitively, states may view further NT3 automation as a way to manage escalation and bolster deterrence. That is signaling to an adversary that any attack, or even the threat of one, might trigger a nuclear response. In other words, a kind of prima facie argument exists that building automated response mechanisms into NT3 systems, something akin to an enhanced version of Russia's dead hand, might resolve the logical paradox inherent with rational-based classical deterrence theory that is premised on MAD and the will to retaliate, thus ensuring mutual vulnerability and improving stability. However, because of the difficulty of demonstrating a posture like this before a crisis or conflict, this kind of implicit threat, akin to Dr. Strangelove's doomsday machine, may likely or more likely worsen crisis stability. In short, while AI-enhanced capabilities offer militaries with major offensive and defensive advantages, being unable to demonstrate this capacity to others, especially in asymmetric situations, will very unlikely promote stability and peace. Moreover, the confusion and uncertainty that would result from mixing various levels and potentially unknown levels of human and machine interaction, as well as AIs reacting to events in non-human ways at machine speed, could dramatically increase inadvertent risk. This risk will be further compounded by an overconfidence in and a reliance on AI decision support tools, known in psychology as automation bias. This can mean that false negatives and positives may go unnoticed or even ignored. The recent defeat of a human F-16 fighter pilot by an AI in the DARPA Alpha Dog Challenge demonstrated clearly how AIs performing in complex and dynamic, albeit virtual environments, can compress decision-making and use unorthodox or non-human tactics in a high-stakes game of human-to-machine chicken. Next slide, please. Okay, so how might various levels of human-to-machine interaction affect deterrence? We saw from recent experimental wargaming hosted by Rancor, exploring the various effects of mixing various degrees of human and machine collaboration on crisis dynamics. And these games revealed some very interesting preliminary findings. The games found, perhaps not surprisingly, that all things being equal, when higher levels of autonomy is combined with human decision-making, or humans in the loop, escalation risk is generally lower. This hypothesis was attributed to the fact that human involvement in decisions allowed more time to de-escalate a situation, and that humans are thought to be better at understanding signaling compared to an AI. In a separate and more speculative configuration, when higher levels of automation is combined with decisions made by machines or humans out of the loop, escalation risk is generally higher. Conceptually speaking, an AI that is optimized to pursue a set of pre-programmed goals might misinterpret an adversary signaling a desire for resolution to avoid conflict or de-escalate the situation, thereby complicating the very delicate balance between an actor's willingness to escalate the situation as a last resort, and keeping the option open to step back from the brink. In sum, while delegating decisions to machines during a conflict may lower the risk to human life and potentially reduce accidents and miscalculation, the absence of a normative deterrence or escalation framework, such as fire breaks, signaling, or de-escalation off-ramps, will further compress or entirely remove various rungs from Herman Kahn's psychological escalation ladder, with uncertain and very destabilizing outcomes. Next slide, please. The employment of AI and autonomy in the nuclear enterprise entails a multitude of trade-offs that should persuade designers, policymakers, and operators to really pause to consider how and whether new AI-powered capabilities might strengthen or complicate stability and deterrence in the fragile, multipolar nuclear world order. Examples of these trade-offs include ensuring adequate control and supervision of AIs to mitigate escalation risk, while exploiting the benefits of increased lethality, scale, and speed afforded by AI tools, assimilating AI into full structure and doctrine, while mitigating the dangers posed by machine speed and reduced levels of control and oversight of nuclear weapons, and designing AI algorithms to support NC3 systems with sufficient knowledge of the laws of engagement and other legal and normative warfaring frameworks, but without degrading the capacity of AIs to predict and respond to threats. But simply, today governments face significant contradictions, dilemmas, open questions, and trade-offs about whether and how and to what extent to integrate AI and autonomy into the nuclear domain, which must be examined in the context of broader quests for deterrence, stability, and non-proliferation goals. Next slide, please. Okay, so to cap things off, what can be done to manage these risks? Lines of effort can be categorized into very broad 4 categories. First, enhancing the safety of nuclear weapons and hardening nuclear systems and processes. For instance, safeguards and risk assessments to strengthen nuclear systems against cyber attack. Second, improving command and control, protocols and mechanisms. For example, adding redundancies and enhancing launch protocols and authentication codes. Third, designing more robust safeguards to contain the consequences of errors and accidents when they inevitably occur, such as improving personnel training and collective monitoring of events. And finally, modifying existing arms control verification approaches and innovating new norms and behavior in the use of AI systems, as well as encouraging bilateral and multilateral confidence building measures and stability dialogue on emerging technology more broadly. In addition, specific recommendations might also include encouraging greater investment in the development of counter AI and cyber defense tools. Towards this effort, DARPA has already begun to study the ways AI might be used to identify vulnerabilities in conventional military systems. AI tools could also be used to support arms verification, to call out cheaters, and assess the nature of suspicious military movements. thereby enhancing the credibility of any future arms-controlled agreements. Bans or limits should and could be considered on the use of AI technology in NC3 systems, autonomous nuclear armed missiles, and especially involving nuclear launch decisions. AI tools could be used to support planners, design, and manage wargaming and other virtual training exercises to help refine operational concepts, test various complex scenarios, and identify future areas for R&D. Social media may not only be a threat, but also a solution together with other open sources. They could, example, be used as independent sources to verify and collaborate official threat and crisis assessments, and to rapidly distribute and disseminate accurate and time-sensitive information during crisis or conflict. Because AI technology is not currently integrated into states' nuclear targeting, command and control, or launch systems, therefore a very narrow window exists for nuclear powers to agree on new principles, practices, norms, and international legal frameworks. For instance, clarifying the lines of responsibility and accountability in the use of AI-enhanced systems if things go wrong. In closing, given the rapid development of these developments, now is the time for positive intervention before it's too late, to preempt and mitigate some of the possible destabilizing effects of AI and help steer it towards enhancing stability as the technology matures. Next and final slide, please. I'd like to thank everyone for their time and interest and attention today. And as large parts of this research is still very much work in progress, I'm looking forward to your feedback, comments, and questions. Thank you.